I'm not sure whether all of you are very familiar with palm oil, so I thought I'd show you the graphic that's done by the Malaysian Palm Oil Board, just to highlight that there are actually two oils from the palm tree. On the right, you see this bunch. It's of little fruits, comes in a big bunch, and when people harvest it, that thing could be 20 kilos, 30 kilos. So you have very agile and strong people to take that off the tree, carry it from the field into wheelbarrows, then into other trucks, and then take it to oil palm mill, where they then cook the fresh fruit bunch, and the fruits will come off cooked, and then they will press it, and you will get the oil, which is on the oil number 1, which is the palm oil, from the actual flesh. So that's the orange part. And then what you have is the brown and white is actually a kernel. And then that one is cracked. And then the palm kernel oil is done in another factory called a palm kernel crusher, because then they need to crush that out. And you get an oil that's a bit like coconut oil, actually. From the second one, palm kernel oil, and then from the orange one is where you get a lot of oil for cooking, and then it's fractionated a bit, well, not kind of like oil and gas, you need to fractionate it, you need to refine it, and you end up with a whole bunch range of products from solid oils and fats to liquid, and many amazing applications. So this has just found amazing uses around the world, everywhere from cooking oil. There's some specialty products which are in your toothpaste. It's in your the sort of cream that goes on top of your cupcakes. It's in your cookies. It's in your hand sanitizers. It's in your wet wipes. During COVID, there was a huge boom in that. It's even in your diesel. And it's also destined for sustainable aviation fuel and renewable diesel. So you almost can't imagine something with such amazing applications. And of course, it's in your bar soap. Some of you might remember palm olive soap. And it's in your home and personal care. It's in your cosmetics. It's just amazing. It's even in your bread. I don't know whether some of you have realized that bread is no longer as dry and as hard as it could often be in the past. And now everything tastes pretty good. There's palm oil in it. It's even used in some of the oil and gas fracking industry. And it's in lubricants as well. Neith and I were talking about it. Way back in history, in the railroads, in the Industrial Revolution. Well, of course, the palm oil then came from West Africa, which is the origin of the oil palm tree. So what happened is that it came to Southeast Asia, which then made it into agro industry that Africa was not able to. It just grew better, and it was processed better, and essentially the fruit has to get to the oil palm mill pretty fast. So that's one of the things of it. It is a little bit caffeine intensive. It may not be as caffeine intensive as sugar. Those mills cost a heck of a lot. These cost something, and then that lends it essentially to a very vertically integrated, and to have big corporations involved in it. Farmers as well as big corporations. So I'm going to go through, after that explanation, the key aspects are to talk through some of the so-called controversies of palm oil. There's a bit of history, bad history with America, unfortunately, on this, bad feelings. And then some positive aspects on ESG. Actually, quite a bit of stuff is done. A lot is known about what needs to bring down the emissions of palm oil. A lot of positive, but actually we get a lot of negative headlines because Indonesia and Malaysia, especially, the politicians talk about it a lot. So you create a lot of headlines, and unfortunately, in the social media world, when you are I'm against EU regulation, it's very hard to explain that. Are you saying that you're against stopping deforestation. So a lot of confusion about that. And then, of course, this has been an essential part of developmentalism in many countries. It's an anti-poverty. And I'm going to then fast forward. Of course, we have fast forwarded decades when we've talked about third generation involved in palm oil. I think the economic increase is very much diminished, especially when you have populations accumulating in rural areas. So essentially, it's also part of a recent political crisis as well. So let's look into that. Oh, sorry, press this. Okay, so some of you may have contributed to this. Who has searched about palm oil online? So this is Google. The green line that you see is, you know, how palm oil has, compared to other commodities, I put in rubber, coffee, cocoa, beef. I think that's part of the beef that palm oil growers have. It's like, why are you focusing on us? The emissions from beef, you know, which is that little pink line. I'm not sure you can see the squiggly line down there. Yeah, there's a bit of heightened interest, but it's way not the interest of people have in palm oil, and that's a lot more destructive and bad for health, etc. The actual brown line, the dark brown line, that actually was kind of similar as palm oil earlier on. I think maybe disregard the noise of the 20, you know, the 204, 205, 06. There's probably not much data there, so it's very squiggly. But probably from 09, 08 onwards, you can, you know, see it as less jumpy. And, you know, it's really about people search about coffee and palm oil. And this is where I actually did put in the word sustainable as well. So it's not just about those topics, but it's about sustainable palm oil and coffee. And as you can see, palm oil really spiked in about 2018, 19. You know, I don't know, can I ask people in the room, like, how many of you were aware of palm oil before 2018, say? Or were you part of the 2018 big spike up of interest? Yeah. Okay. And then things sort of quietened down, you know, during COVID and after, and actually coffee is getting a lot of interest. So they have all that. But, you know, just to again talk a little bit about palm oil, I mean, it's a tree crop. It grows for 15 to 25 years. And usually, you know, that agronomists always say that, you know, tree crops are better than annual crops because you're no longer, you know, you're not just, you know, tilling the soil or whatever every year, every season. So it's theoretically better. But then, of course, as we all know, there are questions arising about deforestation. Where is it planted and how is it planted? So, you know, in principle, it's great. And a lot of farmers love it. I mean, I also want to highlight that it's one of those things that farmers have that, you know, you have, you know, seasonal income. So why do farmers keep cows? Because it gives you regular income, right? Yeah, maybe, I'm not sure exactly, maybe 2 months you don't get your milk or something. And something similar to palm oil as well. So if you're in the tropical or even it extends further now, subtropical, I mean, people in Mexico, Colombia, Ecuador, you know, in Latin America, Central America, are actually starting to favor this as well, because it can provide a more regular income. And it's even going to non-traditional areas. Normally it's grown very tight around the equatorial belt and maybe up to, you know, I don't know, 15 degrees, you know, that's the ideal. But, you know, southern Thailand, it's going further north. India wants to subsidize this because they want to do import substitution. Thailand did it for import substitution reasons as well. And a lot of other countries are doing this. So actually the farmer interest in this is also tremendous. Because of that income stability that it can offer, or even just the outright subsidies. And of course, agriculture is an industry that is heavily subsidized in many countries across the world for various reasons of food security and for farmer incomes. And, you know, and broadly, it's due to 2 countries, but, you know, annually you're consuming on average 9 kilos of palm oil. And I forgot the comparisons, but everyone's consuming a lot of sugar as well, and beef and everything. So there's heaps of kilos. And I mean, even a very strange thing that a friend was talking to me about, which actually cropped up recently, how much insects are we consuming a year as well? It's a fair bit, because it's actually in the grains and in everything that we are, although they are talking about it as a serious protein, but it gets into stuff as well. So, a lot of consumption is going on. I really like these maps that the USDA has done. So I want to, say thank you to USDA for this. I've sort of squeezed in on the left. You can see how concentrated, how regionally concentrated is production. Indonesia, 47 million tons. Malaysia, 19 million. Thailand is doing amazingly as well, almost 3.5 million a day. Last year, exported 1 billion tons. So that really made people sit up, because suddenly, when Indonesia was banning the export of palm oil, I'm going to talk about it a bit more, but there was basically a lot of political embarrassment in Indonesia, because for producing 47 million tons, somehow the industry was not able to supply enough cooking oil to Indonesians. So guess what? The politicians were very, very upset. And they banned the export for 2 weeks. And there were export restrictions. And essentially then Thailand started to fill the gap into India. And it's even supplying 15, I think even 20% of India, which is a huge, huge demand market. And you can see other places, Colombia, Nigeria, Papua New Guinea. We had a question about Papua New Guinea before we started this as well. And in so many places, and I've explained why farmers find this impetus to do so. And the little red dots are actually palm oil mills. I already mentioned that there is a capital intensity in this activity. If you can get your fruit to an oil palm mill within 6 hours and processed and everything, which is very exacting, not many people do that, but you end up with an extremely high grade of palm oil that then is used in so for these kind of products, you need extremely high grades. And these are the value-added products that are coming in. But normally, it's not so. There's a lot of different grades going on out there. And you can see how many mills there are, right? All over the place. And you can also look at the distribution. I mean, politically, this is important, right? You can immediately see it geographically, how important it is. Thailand is in the mid-south. It's even in Philippines a little bit, coming in to that part north of Sabah. So in the Borneo Kalimantan zone, you can see it's so tremendously important, especially, and it has come inland as well, from where people used to plant it closer to the coast. So that's where you get some of your controversies about where it's planted. I mean, traditionally, it was in North Sumatra. If you can look at the Indonesia map, that's Sumatra Utara. In fact, that's where the original oil palm estates were done, and then you had the Indonesian conflict, and then the planters then went off to Peninsular Malaysia to plant oil palm, and then it then looped back into Indonesia, especially after 97, 98. Indonesia had a problem planting it initially because of the rules were quite restricted. If you're a company who wanted to plant oil palm, you had to do 80% for smallholders and then 20% for yourself. So after the Asian financial crisis, due to economic reforms, World Bank, IMF, etc., I'm not sure who exactly came up with the idea, they flipped it around. So therefore, a company could own 80% of the land, or at least have a concession, it's not really ownership, have a concession for 80% and 20% for smallholder. So guess what? Indonesia boomed as a result of that economic reform, which then, of course, then engendered a whole bunch of social issues as well from that. And this is just to show you some of the other places. The other thing to mention as well is that a lot of other countries are planting oil palm, but they sort of came later than Indonesia and Malaysia, and they started off their industries with pledges of non-deforestation straight off. Thailand, for example, I'm going to have a separate slide on that. It's 90% smallholders, and it looks as though it's less than 10% on forest deforestation of land use change. And that's a bit of a contrast to places like, say, Malaysia, where you have 40% smallholders, but 20% of that were under these huge development programs, World Bank funded, and then 20% are what you would see as independent smallholders, like basically the small guys going out and doing their thing, as opposed to somebody going to clear large areas and then transmigrating people into it. So it's a different model. And in places like Colombia, Ecuador, Mexico, they have all pretty much pledged to start as non-deforestation, because they are trying to differentiate against the problems that we face in Malaysia and Indonesia. And of course, it's not just forests, actually. To be fair, I believe Indonesia maybe, actually, I can give you the reference. I forget the data, but a large chunk of it was actually conversion from rubber and rice areas into oil palms. So actually, it wasn't not all about deforestation. A lot of it was conversion. And the same is true about Peninsular Malaysia. The wholesale conversion of rubber into oil palm was a lot of the story. But then if you look at the Borneo and Kalimantan area, that was obviously not quite the story, because they weren't very populated anyway. So that was a different situation. But yeah, so you can see where it's happening elsewhere. And just to show you some pictures of what it looks like, you may have already seen these. I talked about the wheelbarrows. I talked about the small trucks loaded onto bigger trucks, and then there it goes. One thing to note about the contemporary palm oil situation is that with this kind of duopoly of production, there is a coordination now to this Council of Palm Oil Producing Countries, in their own words, or if not in their own words, at least the politicians who are linked into these countries call it trying to establish an OPEC of palm oil. It doesn't quite work like that, but in reality, what we have is Indonesia, being such a huge producer, actually expanding their own domestic consumption of palm oil. So that has actually effectively reduced the supplies over time and the growth of supplies into the international market. So everyone's facing higher prices than ever before because of that. And of course, we had disruptions in the Ukraine crisis as well, which affected vegetable oils. So just to highlight, you wouldn't be surprised that with such big importance in these two countries, we're kind of familiar with this idea of the global north versus the global south, but actually there's quite a lot of south-south, tussles as well, little tussles going on. People in Malaysia, Indonesia say, oh, I'm worried about EU deforestation, it's banned. I think the word ban is a bit overstated, because they give you clear indications of how you can enter the EU market, and actually the big companies are doing terribly well, with certified palm oil supplying into the EU market, and they are very well positioned to supply. But the politicians talk about bans, and then it's not really that, but actually where the first actual ban did happen on palm oil was actually India. And this was a retaliation against, a couple of years ago, Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad comments on Kashmir and citizenship in India. And he was basically positioned under the government, which was essentially had overturned the long-ruling coalition into what was a reformist government. And he was kind of an ambassador of palm oil, because he was advocating drinking a spoonful a day. It's kind of like some people, I'm not sure anyone wants to put up their hand, a spoonful of olive oil or a spoonful of coconut oil. There's a really good product, you should check it out, called red palm oil, which is kind of minimally processed, but without heat, which basically then strips out a lot of the nutrients in many products, not just palm oil actually. In a lot of what we consume is damaged by heat process. So that's something worth looking at. And of course, the diplomacy of palm oil as well, you know, going to China and getting a deal, getting an MOU, you know, putting up big banners and you know, the whole flower garland thing. I think this is something that actually India is also very charming with palm oil when it's not banning it. That was a momentary thing. You know, I had a reflection with somebody yesterday as well, just commenting about, you know, even in you know, in cultural matters, how China has actually been very diplomatic and open in Southeast Asia and in the Pacific Islands and elsewhere. Maybe this is something I want to highlight, that maybe the West has gotten too used to doing trade flows and not sitting down and taking time and talking to people and you know, not just coming in to sort out the deal, but you know, just spending a bit more face time, which is a very Asian, to talk to people a bit more, and you know, have to have a lunch and stuff. So, so that's something that we're kind of seeing in terms of culture and approach, that you know, maybe the West could you know, be a bit more charming, and definitely, I think everyone has issues in and out of stuff. But you know, palm oil is a bit scarred by this experience in the 80s, essentially in the late 80s. There was this, you know, American soybean actually did have a specific campaign against palm and coconut oils. They called it the tropical grease, and they had you know, brochures and stuff. I'm not sure about anything in the newspapers, but you know, I mean, Washington Post picked up on it. I put something more recent, I think, from Harvard Health. Basically, there was a kind of sudden, like, oh, new product coming onto the market, we should be a bit defensive, we should help protect farmers. I mean, this is something that actually even palm oil does nowadays for itself, right? You do get a bit protective. People ask you things about your product. But you know, after this campaign, they sort of stood down because they decided that let's not go negative on each other, because there are quite a lot of negatives in the food industry when you start saying too many things about each other. And oops, sorry. I just wanted to highlight that palm oil really took off because there was a realization that there were certain margarine products that were actually quite unhealthy because of trans fats. And then because the food industry had to take those out voluntarily, and then later, because of regulations, then palm oil essentially boomed because of that. So that was the big thing for palm oil, that actually this you know, health measure in US and elsewhere, they had to come in. But then, you know, fast forward, I'm just sharing this thing from ChatGPT. Actually, I picked it off the palm oil chat group. I'm in some chat groups with people who do you know, grow palm oil, and they're very sad to see the negative news about palm oil. So, you know, I think ChatGPT kind of reflects on what's in the internet. So that's what it is. And then that's on the right, in the middle is a sonnet. Both are sonnets, actually. And one is about soybean, actually. So you have a soybean, you know, waxing very nicely about soy from Asia, and then we have you know, Asia growing palm oil and not getting a very good story from this ChatGPT. And then on the right, I think some of you will be very interested in the different issues and carbon emissions. So I put the green as palm oil. So it's a higher emitting product, because the problem arises if you plant it on peatland, which then have these methane emissions and land subsidence and all that. So that imputes a lot of emissions because of that. And also if you had deforestation, so there's all these average figures that happen, right? And but in reality, what happens is that what is then supplied, or what will be supplied to the EU and other markets who want low emissions, you will get the product from the areas which were maybe long developed, but not on peatland. So you basically filter for you saw how many mills there were out there. I mean, that's like 1,000 plus. You will then maybe buy from the, I don't know, 200 mills, which have the lower emissions. So in reality, you wouldn't have to buy what is, say, the average situation there on, you know, sort of default values, you know, assuming that everyone has the same profile of deforestation and peatland development. And then the yellow arrows show you soybean oil, olive oil, rapeseed oil, sunflower oil. So there's a kind of ranking there. And if you get the low emission palm oil, it's obviously pretty low. And in fact, there's some in Papua New Guinea where it's zero emission and even positive because they improved the carbon situation. So you can get really good stuff as well. And the places where there's lower, I can't see, is the top beef emissions? Yes. So the top emissions are beef, lamb and mutton, cheese, dairy, beef. Dark chocolate is actually really high. I know. How interesting. Coffee, and shrimp. How interesting. Sorry, fast shrimp. Sorry, not fresh caught. I think it's hard to find fresh caught anymore. Farm shrimps. So those are the ones which are up there. So yeah, then you get people in Southeast Asia saying Western bias and all this sort of finger pointing issues happening. But I think I want to be clear that there's actually a lot of positive moves that can be made, and not just palm oil, right? Everyone else, every other corporation out there is trying to reduce their product carbon footprint, and you can get good low carbon emission product, and then there'll be markets who don't care. Will then be getting the high emission ones, getting the ones that say the Europe or US are willing to pay for. So yeah, we're gonna. I guess maybe will be interesting to see. I'm not sure whether front of pack people are putting carbon emissions yet, but what you do get are things like saturated fats, sugar, and salt indicators. And unfortunately, that was one of the issues of palm oil. Actually, they didn't want to label as a saturated fat because then people have the perception that clogs your heart. Although the research is, might say otherwise, but it's not that clear. There's a visual of that people are pretty much clear on that's a worry. And in fact, it's not just in the West. I mean, I think if you go to doctors in Malaysia or Indonesia, they also tell you not to take saturated fats, and they're not that promoting of palm oil either, frankly, because the medical profession is kind of sticks to their things. So that's health issues, but I mean, you do have labor issues as well. I mean, I want to point out on the right-hand side, U.S. Customs and Border Patrol kicked in the last couple of years. They removed, during the Obama regulation, they removed one item which then sort of exempted imports from U.S. labor regulations, because if it wasn't available locally, domestically in the US. So that was removed. And then that resulted in then a slew of regulatory requirements. So they were quiet for 2 years of the regulation. And then they sort of staffed up USCBP. And then the NGO started reporting forced labor problems. And then that's when you started to get, a lot of cases, China, elsewhere, of course, as well. And actually, Malaysia caught a lot of cases as well on rubber gloves and on palm oil. So 2 companies were involved. Of course, Time Darby Plantations is one, but they got lifted from that. They cleared themselves off that. At one stage, for a small country, of course, it's a big exporter. So that's why it's pretty exposed. And it has a systemic labor issue because you are talking about 95% of migrant labor reliance. And in Malaysia's case, it's actually migrants from external, right? Indonesia, there's a lot of internal migrants, but people are often less concerned about that because, you are Indonesians, you understand your political and your rights. But then if you have 95% from Indonesians coming to Malaysia, okay, a bunch of them become Malaysians, but then you have people from Bangladesh, Nepal, and other places like that, then their rights and the forced labor issues become very prominent. So that there has been efforts by the plantations, especially the big companies, to regularize that, to make sure everything is okay. Sometimes reparations are involved as well. Some companies have paid reparations. It's not really well reported, but on the rubber gloves, some cases have been, I think, almost $5,000 per worker, depending on the time frame or depending on where, because workers then also bid to get these jobs, right? There's brokers, there's brokers in the villages, brokers in the region, and then they kind of outcompete each other to go into debt to then secure these jobs overseas. And then they have a debt problem when they work overseas and whether they make enough money. So then what happens? I had this question yesterday as well. Then who helps them? I mean, I think nowadays the embassies help them, the Indonesian embassy, the Bangladesh embassy, because it's become such a problem that even the legislatures in Indonesia and Bangladesh, I'm not sure whether they've done it yet, but they have basically passed laws to help migrant workers, which then requires their regulators and their embassies actually can actively help and actually negotiate countries like Malaysia and elsewhere in Singapore, make sure that when they come, they understand what the contracts are, pay is better, and that they actually get rest days and things like that. So I put a couple of links there. I don't think we'll really look at the video. You can check it out yourself. I think these DW is a German, a more kind of recent documentary, and then Bloomberg does it. Unilever is a big company that buys palm oil. They also have a lot of explanations about how they're trying to help communities in their supply chains and also communities outside the supply chain. So it's interesting that companies which have already done a lot of certification and traceability work, they're also now trying to go outside their areas to help as well. So, I mean, this has been, since 2004, the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil was established. So we are talking about nearly 20 years into these efforts. So efforts have kind of matured. And also what has happened actually, especially places like Indonesia, the policies have also come in quite strongly. What you had in the past was, sorry, the charts were a bit overcomplicated. I kind of put the brown dotted lines to show the overall trend of palm oil price going up, and the blue line, is that right? No, tree cover loss going up, and then the blue line of palm oil price going up. So essentially what happens is when farmers see prices going up, they get very enthusiastic and buy more seeds. And I have colleagues that I worked with before who trace things like seed sales, and it's a very clear pattern, price up, seed purchases up, price down, seed purchases down. So the question is, where do the politicians allow you to plant it? And that's obviously the crux of it. And I suppose, prices came down, so the interest to grow actually came down, and there was a lot less deforestation. But I think what Indonesia is talking a lot about now, and not just Indonesia, but Southeast Asia, is how commodity prices have surged. You can see that spike up more recently, but actually deforestation stayed down. So this is what they're trying to achieve, that they have basically de-linked their policy and regulations have dampened the whole deforestation issue, so that even if commodity prices go high, they're not allowing farmers to just go and plant every which way that they want to. So that's the big thing. And of course, what happened under President Jokowi was moratorium on no more large concessions, not on peatland development. They've moved on peatland restoration. So this is very important for climate change actions. Indonesia has NDCs, commitments to reduce emissions and act on it. So they do have to prevent fires, because that happens and that causes a lot of emissions. And they have put in a lot of fines. They have deals with Norway. They're taking jurisdictional approaches as well. So this is taking a sub-national level of data and actions. And Indonesia is quite an interesting place because they do have a lot of NGOs and stakeholder activities and engagements, even going down to the local level. I was talking to somebody telling me very positively of a project in Aceh where they found a local politician and district office, which was then very amenable, because you can have these regulations and you can have big companies or NGOs wanting to do things, but if the local politicians at the local level don't assist to, say, regularize land title uncertainty or say that yes, you can conserve this area even though it's slated for a business project. There's even issues like that you can't even do conservation because you don't have a permit for that. Your permit is actually to do business. You're supposed to do business in that area, you're not supposed to conserve it. So there's a lot of those kind of things to iron out. And then on the demand side, of course, they do promote cooking oil a lot. I talked earlier about this cartel and corruption issue that they face because, why are you not selling to Indonesians? You want to export because you don't want to sell at a lower domestic price that the government set. You want to sell at a higher national price. And then what also happens is that the industry subsidizes itself to burn palm oil in biodiesel. So when they do this, they blend 30% into diesel. So then that reduces external supply, and then that actually indirectly then helps boost palm oil prices. And then, of course, that is a big political issue, as you can imagine. So a lot of things going on. And I'm going to fast forward now. I mean, we talked about the US worried about health issues. Actually, the health issues are also in the global south. And this is where palm oil does face a lot of questions from even their own middle class, upper middle class in Malaysia, Indonesia, India. This is on the left is India. In the middle is Singapore subsidizing canola oil. That's more healthy. They wanted to reduce palm oil. This is where you go to the food centers where a lot of people buy their food because it's cheaper and the government wants to promote the health. And even Pakistan was testing Banaspati is a solid palm oil product you use in flatbreads. And they were mulling ban limits on it because they weren't happy with the quality of the oil used. And in Hong Kong, they were testing cookies. I mean, they were testing Oreos, all sorts of things, crackers. Were there contaminants in it, which could then risk on cancer? So as you can see, health issues are still very much on the card. It's not just a Western question, it's a middle class question. Yeah, so that's on the controversies. I think maybe I'll just move a bit faster now. I think I'm going to talk about the achievements, which I've really alluded to a bit, but maybe just to highlight to you as well. I mean, this is what big companies are doing. They're tracing, right? I think the green transition is actually a data transition as well because they prove to people what we're doing. And I think this is part of trying to get past the question of greenwashing, right? Exactly what are you doing? The regulators are asking you. The EU then wants to say that, look, I want to ask you exactly what you're doing because, I mean, 1,400 mils is in Unilever's purchase list, right? But actually the number of mills which are certified is actually not 200, like I said, it's actually almost 300. But then they list a lot of mills which they may not be purchasing from, but it's still a huge list. And if you go to 2023, they're now listing 1,600 mills. So I think this is where I'm sure they're buying good stuff, but this is just to highlight that when the corporations do the traceability, they are very inclusive. And maybe what the public or what the regulator wants to know is, okay, exactly who you're buying from. Then it'll be clear that, I'm buying from these 296 mills because they have the certification, which is actually kind of what's happening anyway, because Unilever is one of those companies that buys 100% roundtable on sustainable palm oil products. And there's a couple of other companies, major companies to do that as well. And then so what the EUDR wants to go in is then to say that I'm going to audit and of the volumes to make sure that what you guys say is true, because as you can see, if you take the headline figures, it's not very clear what they're doing, although they are doing a lot more than what they say. So maybe it's the communications issue as well, about buying from the certified, as well as listing a whole bunch of other things. And the reason why this comes about partly is that NGOs, I had this question yesterday as well. What do NGOs do in this sector? They do things like this. It's amazing. So 1,400 mils. So what they did was they focused on that area with a lot of colors is actually called Pesonilo, which is a supposed to be a forest reserve that then got majorly planted up. I mean, these are, I guess, small small farmers or small companies who planted in that area and not obviously not certified, probably not even licensed at all by the government. And these are the problem. As you can see, 16 the Teso Nilo part 16% was natural forest left in 2017, and then people had planted pulpwood, oil palm, and cleared the areas. And then NGOs have basically said that, hey, all you big companies, you say you're buying sustainable palm oil, but we trace trucks. So they're basically tracing trucks that then go to palm oil mills that then deliver to those red things are refineries. So then how did illegal product end up in these places? So I guess that's where clarity has to come out, and where the EU and all those don't want products from those areas. But then, of course, why the countries are worried about regulations is essentially within the certified system, not many smallholders are involved. I think not surprisingly, right? Big companies can afford it. We can hire headquarter teams to do all this sustainability communications easily. In a big plantation company, you're talking about, I don't know, hiring 6 people at headquarters level and dozens and dozens, if not more, of people, and whole boatload of consultants to help you do this. So smallholders are not very involved in this. Certification has reached about 20-22% of palm oil on RSPO, and within that 20 to 22%, 15, I think below 15% is smallholders. So then this is seen as not very inclusive and unfair, and not helping the small farmers, who are essentially the voters in these big countries. And then again, back to the environmental issues. We talked about the emissions, so this kind of shows you the emissions there. There's the purple down there is an example of one company's emissions. So you can see how low they can push it from that. So you need the orange one, which is a default value for non-certified palm oil. RSPO. Sorry, the orange is what? The orange is non-certified palm oil. So that's the emissions. You can see it's significantly higher. The blue one is RSPO certified, and the purple, the violet one is a company that has worked very hard or has very old established areas and worked very hard to lower their emissions. Essentially, there's a few things. We don't want to be planting on land. We want to capture the when you process palm oil, you have basically a lot of waste material that then emits methane. So you want to then cover that. You want to capture the methane, don't let it out into the atmosphere. So there's a lot of known activity to do this, and it's been happening. And then on the right-hand side is to highlight that if you follow the RSPO rules, the recent development of palm oil has actually been pretty positive. That it's actually now involving 24% conservation areas for the recent plantings, and about 60% planted. In the past, taking the scenario of a potential deforestation, what would happen is it would be 100%, well, almost 100% deforested unless it's steep areas, because the regulators wouldn't let you do that. Theoretically, if that's implemented, and it would be 85% planted, and 15% would be kept for infrastructure like roads, housing, and mills. And that would have been business as usual, the old formula. So now, if you follow these, the new formula is 60% planted and almost a quarter of conservation areas. So that's significant changes on that front. I mentioned Thai palm oil earlier. This is obviously kind of maybe what people desire to buy. I'm buying smallholders, I'm helping smallholders, 90% of smallholders, and it's less than 10%, involved forest land use change. Of course, this is historic, right? If you look at the EU's cut-off date for deforestation, it's actually 31st December 2020, which is actually very forgiving. So a lot of things can go in with the 31st December 2020. It's just that you need to gather your data so that you can be audited. So what they're it's a lot of people I talk to in palm oil say, look, that's a great win. We won because the cut-off date is so recent. It's not 10 years ago, it's not 20 years ago. then that would actually be more restrictive. So what is the problem now is that you have to prepare your data. But I have a very positive view on the data actually, because these products, palm oil products, are essentially around $800 to $1,000+. And I believe if you do the data that the EUDR requires at scale, this will be less than $1 US ton, if not less than that. But it's a lot of it's effort, and you have to do it at scale. But this is the kind of story that maybe Thai palm oil. My question, I'm in the midst of some research on this. When they suddenly came out and exported a lot, it all went to India, where the criteria are not really there, but it's you can quickly sell. So my question is whether Thai palm oil will then be trying to market itself as green, get profit margins on green, because there are quite good profit margins on green. This is 10 to 20% on top of the profit on your base product. And then if you go value added as well, you earn more on that. So there's a lot of effort to do green and value added products, and which is what the big companies are doing. And talking about worries about smallholder, this is a kind of tale of two smallholders. In Malaysia, the headlines is, we don't like EUDR, it's threatening the livelihood of millions. But then when I read some of the headlines in Indonesia, there's the largest smallholder union in Indonesia says it welcomes the regulations as it supports traceability, investment into smallholders and fair prices. So they are actually saying that, why don't you give me a quota, or if you give me market access in EU, why don't you buy, I forgot what the figure they asked for, maybe a third from them. And then they have set up an organization to actually collect funding to get help. And they basically want, they want to access, these difficult markets, because I'm not sure whether all of you have the same experience, but sometimes difficult customers, they kind of understand that they are being difficult, they're asking for more, and they're willing to pay more. So that's what's essentially happening in this top 20% of the market. And then more people want to access that. And I recently saw that the Smallholder Union came up with a costing, and when I amortize some of their costing, it is within that range that I indicated. This is going to be less than $1 per ton to get your data ready. So smallholder. Yeah. I mean, they have some values that they put in, and then of course what I did was I said, okay, this is going to take a few years, or let's amortize it a couple of years. I'll try to break down that data more actually. I haven't had a chance to, but on the first glance, it looks like they can do that. And as I mentioned already, you are talking about green premiums. There is competition. The companies compete to sell to customers these premium products with green certification. And so not only companies compete, as I mentioned, countries compete as well. The newer palm oil growing countries have recognized that they can start off on a footing of non-deforestation. And as I mentioned just now, smallholders also see a chance to compete to do this. And it's not just palm oil now, of course, right? I mean, all these products are now facing the situation: cattle, cocoa, coffee, soya, wood, rubber, and derivatives. I was in DC in July. I met up with an American company who was a big buyer of palm oil. They also buy soy, and they also buy beef. And I said, so how's it going with all these things? And he said, actually, we're okay on palm. Because why? They've been doing it for 20 years. There is 20 years of activity to build on. They're actually more worried about soy, because soy is a product. I mean, Brazil has a bunch of moratoriums and things as well, but I think as you all will know, under Bolsonaro, there was a big deforestation drive. They sort of let everything happen. And then also the product itself, because what worries these buyers in the US is that the soybean can be kept for longer than palm oil. So then it's harder to trace, right? You can keep it and then they can't trace it. But palm oil, as we mentioned, you need to get it to the mill quite fast. So that actually lends it a bit easier to tracing, although not easy for everyone, because smallholders have this big chain of, they sell it to dealers and dealers sell it to dealers. And this is where quite often in the Indonesian and Malaysia scenario, because there are layers of dealers, that then makes it difficult to trace. But then in the newer palm producing countries where they have very short supply chains, basically the mills, there's maybe 1 or 2 mills, and then the smallholders, it's essentially a captive situation. So when you think captive, you think bad, but in this sense, captive is good, because then the mill can easily say that, oh, look, I'm the only buyer, then therefore I can invest in you, because then, I don't know, Unilever or somebody who's making infant formula is then giving me a good price. I'm going to share it with you, the green premiums, and then they can have a good long-term working relationship. But when you have in the rural area a very market-driven system where the farmer doesn't know where their product ends up in, then that's where a lot more questions arise, and where the different situations of length of supply chain sort of matter. So, okay, so, just to zoom back up to that higher level, it is an oligopolistic trading system. You remember I showed you those red things where I said the mill supply? Those are refiners. So refiners is actually a very concentrated sector. You're talking about, 4, 5, 6 companies. As you can see, those green pies, actually all of them, this is an old one, sorry, all of them have pledges on deforestation. So all that is now green. But essentially, if you look at the big chunks, like say Wilmar, Golden Agri, Cargill, IOI, you think a few of them, a handful of companies are, 3/4 of the supply chain. So it's a very concentrated supply chain, and therefore they're able to afford to do sustainability efforts, and also they can and they also can't, because the upstream, you will recall that I told you only 20% is certified. So that means, these companies aren't going to collapse their business, right? So they have a segment of business that takes 20% certified to the buyers who are willing to pay the actual premium for that. And then they also supply China, they also supply India. And then this is where I think the EU wants that clarity of that. And maybe the US as well, right? You have Biden executive order for state to look into non-deforestation commodities. So is this going to be the same question? And in this last bit, I just want to turn to the post-poverty politics of things. I talked about the early developmentalism. This shows you the picture of what happened in Malaysia. Sorry, the colors are similar, but it's completely different topics. I should have told the editor to color it very differently. Actually, they didn't position it side by side. This is my fault. I just put it together. But I want to highlight in diagram ES1, oil palm basically has gone from 1960 to whatever it is, 2% of Malaysia's total crop area to now 35%. Well, not now, but by 1990 it was 35%. So that was the really big boom of oil palm, essentially in peninsular Malaysia. After that, the expansion then went to Sabah. Sabah was actually around the same time in the 90s. And then Sarawak was basically kind of more of a post-90s expansion. And what you see is then rubber was kind of there. Now it's already going to be down. But it's essentially a rubber and coconut kind of story that then went to oil palm. And the diagram on the right actually shows you how important was this Felder development program. So this was a statist move where you basically do large-scale land development. Is done by contractors. They do large-scale clearing, do large engineering projects to plant it up, and then they then transmigrate poor people, poor families into these areas, and they have a lot of clarity into the income that's going to come from that. So that's why it's done in that way. And what happened initially is that the corporations were not involved in that expansion phase. That went pretty much to Felder. You can see at one point the gray line on the right chart showed you that 30% of the new expansion areas were taken up for families, essentially. So a very anti-poverty thing. And then the decline is basically the share of this development project just declining because everyone else expanded, the corporations expanded, other smallholders expanded. So their share has come down to about 15% and less. So this was really iconic about this, and this really informed a lot of Indonesia's development as well, but with less capital. This was World Bank loans were given for this, other support, and it was a huge socio-economic project, and this was actually a huge vote bank for this the ruling coalition, the UMNO Barisan National political coalition for 50 years essentially. People were really grateful. I'm going to show you what the income situation looked like. The yellow line, the light yellow line that goes across it, this was an old chart that I did for a report that I wasn't happy with because I wanted to show you the inflation. So I did that dash line. But the story is basically that these people had an income that was below 200 ringgit. And then what happened is then when they got into, well, they did rubber initially, then they replanted into palm oil. But when they had the palm oil, the income are those various lines up there. It's squiggly because commodity prices move up and down. But essentially what you can see is that compared to that yellow thing, the yellow dash one would be a fairer thing, right? Because I put it in inflation. You can see that it was very rare that the palm oil price actually went down close to the poverty situation that they had in the past. And essentially, you're talking about multiple times higher income. And then also there was effort to diversify the income as well. Broadly, there wasn't much data on income, so I had to make estimates and assumptions. But if you targeted 20% of income from other secondary incomes, and then of course maybe that didn't work out great, so they started to give out handouts, right? They gave out subsidies, direct cash subsidies. So that could easily be another 20%. So basically what you're talking about is, maybe a situation of, 40 to 60% of the income actually from the oil palm crop. And then depending on the price, of course, and then maybe another 40% from subsidies as well as secondary income sources. And that's your settler family. But, this is probably relevant for the first and second generation of oil palm farmers. Because in Malaysia, what happened then is in second generation, all the children left, not all, maybe one stayed behind, because we had this huge urban industrial. So that works out. So your second generation is then secured because there isn't pressure in the rural area because most of them left, got great jobs and good education. So the social mobility was also another amazing story from this. But what happened now is third generation. So then, Malaysia is not having this industrial boom anymore, right? China has taken a lot of the expansion. Southeast Asia is growing fast, but Malaysia is hitting that middle income trap and not taking people into the urban areas. And so you start to have an accumulation of people in the rural areas. And then I was looking at the rural incomes in around 2016 actually. And already then, making estimates based on the official statistics, you could see that the younger people in the rural areas basically at minimum wage. And that's not a great story, and that can last for quite long. And I think maybe what has happened now in the recent national and state elections that we had, especially when they in Malaysia just lowered the voting age to 18, this constituency of young people with minimum wage, underemployment, spoke up very loud, and essentially they hit out at the ruling coalition. The typical assumption is that you're so grateful that you will then keep voting for whoever's the ruling party or coalition. But this kind of basically broke down. And in fact, I've been talking to Indonesian groups as well, and this is before this kind of shocking election result, which basically repudiates, the rural policy of Malaysia. They needed to have diversified away from palm oil because the economic carrying capacity was exceeded, and they were not able to bring in a good rural income alternate sources. And I was reflecting on something. I spoke to a big plantation group in Indonesia before COVID that said, you guys are conglomerates, right? They don't just operate palm oil. They operate a lot of other businesses. I said, are you hiring people? Are you hiring the young people, the children of your smallholders? And they said, oh yeah, you should look into that. And I think they are. And in fact, other things that the Indonesian corporations are doing as well, they're starting to train their smallholders to plant vegetables and fruits. You can see this effort at diversifying of income. So yeah, I mean, it's we have hit a political crunch with palm oil and domestically. This one was basically trying to show elections. So I was showing the orange bits were, the orange rectangles are the different elections of Malaysia against palm oil prices. So this kind of worked until about 2022. But then I think with the youth vote coming in, and also, I was listening to people who go to the field. I don't go to the field that much, saying that they're very unhappy. So I said, I just dug out that old statistic and said, yeah, I think they weren't very happy for a while, but now they're expressing it and happening. And of course, this is about Johor, which is the southernmost state. But yeah, I think they're kind of an exceptional location because they're just north of Singapore, and it's a very urbanized state. So the young people there have a lot of income opportunities. Whereas what happened in Peninsular Malaysia is that the Islamic parties have essentially come down. So they were in the northeast of Malaysia, and so they then went across the north of the peninsula, captured a lot of electoral wins there, and then they've come down the west coast, which is essentially the most prosperous region of the Peninsular Malaysia, and they have reached to Selangor, which is the one of the key states around the capital, and also they have reached they have good wins in, as I mentioned, Felda. This incredible development story. You have so much to be grateful for. Then voting for the Islamic Party in Negeri Sembilan, which is then south of Kuala Lumpur, the capital. So essentially, you have political Islam coming in, but I think it's also more than that. It's also the fact of a rejection of I think in a way lack of economic strategy, lack of an economic story for rural youth, and of course, a lot of seats being gone to the Islamic Party and Nationalist Party as well. So I think that's a bit of a shocker that the palm oil story has kind of run out of steam domestic. So okay, I think maybe we should kind of finish on that. I'm not gonna. I think this is kind of a quick reflection. I think palm oil seems to have a lot of prices and questions around it, but I think the solutions are kind of at hand, and also the demand usages are just so resilient. We talked about how many applications. I mean, if this is going into sustainable aviation fuel, the people that I talk to who are buying, who trade energy products, they are just very positive, and which is why they see the EU non-deforestation policy actually quite receptive of palm oil. It's just that, please show us your credentials, but still very receptive of that. So I think that's the key thing about the underlying demand is still seen as very positive. I think the challenges are really about oligopolistic issues, as happened with the cooking oil in Indonesia. How are you including the farmers? And then, for farmers to be included, then there's a lot of issues about, the federal, national, and state relations, state business relations, the capacity of the states to help, capacity of state-owned enterprises to help. How is that happening? Political will, what about more bottoms up rather than top down? I think this is where maybe Malaysia is a little bit more top down and not very stakeholder driven, whereas Indonesia has opened to that more, and maybe that's why you can see that the Indonesian stakeholder group seems to be more aware and seems to be reaching out more compared to Malaysia, taking very much a backseat to more political headlines. This issue of market access. I didn't talk about forced labor much. Neith and I were talking about it beforehand, but I have a bunch of calculations as well about forced labor compliance costs. I mean, if you're not going to have systemic reform, then the private companies have to pay more, right, for labor compliance issues. There's some indicative things saying this might look a bit high, 30 to 50% more, but let's see. And then, of course, we also mentioned about geopolitical issues. You know, if China and India are more charming, although not all the time charming, they look it out as well because they know that this is something that it passes the bottom of, Malaysian and Indonesian politicians. They can do positive as well as negative. What about, Western engagement as well? I mean, the Southeast Asia expects to be courted a bit more nowadays. They expect more diplomacy because, hey, we've got China. Guys, do you guys want to talk to us more? Do a lot more with you. And then these are some of those indicators that we have about, survey respondents identifying maybe a bit disproportionately on China's economic importance. I think it is disproportionate against economic reality. But then this kind of informs how I think sustainability is going to evolve because people disproportionately feel China is important and less, and they're not going to act as much. And of course, it is oligopolistic countries and quite often authoritarian as well. So these things, and then of course the positives that I've mentioned as well, about a lot of corporate action, but a lot of competitive interest to supply as well. And then I think just talking about how supply chains may need to be seen as an opportunity rather than a threat or a problem.
Thank you so much. I think most of us who know very little about palm industry will go to Malcolm today. And so I guess I will open this discussion up to everyone here. And if you're online, please submit your question through the Q&A question. So anyone?
I'm trying to figure out how to formulate it as a question. Yeah, sure. Hi, Edie Friedman. I'm a professor in Manhattan. And I'm interested in what feels like a real set of trade-offs between smallholders and consolidation and larger kind of owners and conglomerates, and questions about migrant workers and certifying accountability. But it feels like smallholders is a lot harder to trace back in the supply chain, and the working conditions are standards and environmental standards. But the larger consolidation that is throwing smallholders like kind of under the bus. And you did kind of gloss over this question about forced labor, but it feels like particularly in Malaysia, all the labor is being done by migrant workers. Local Malaysians aren't taking those jobs, and it's very hard for activists and rights organizations to get onto the job site. So, I'm wondering if there's any conversation at the political level or even within the larger international trading and multinational.
Yeah, no, thank you. I think I didn't mention much here. I was doing a talk yesterday where we talked a lot about forced labor, and maybe I'll share that link as well on this on green supply chains. So it is a systemic issue, especially for Malaysia, right? The moment you see a statistic of 90%, migrant workers, it is a big orange flag, if not a red flag. I think what happens is that the big companies, so it's not just palm oil, it's affecting electronic companies. It's I think Dyson had to tell one of their manufacturers, no, we can't stick with you anymore. I even saw I don't know the details, but Goodyear had to pay reparations as well, and it was in the region of $10,000 per worker. It's quite big. And I think I mentioned as well that the rubber glove companies to then basically be released
from the US CDP list. So then their cargoes would come to the US. They essentially paid around, I don't know what it is, $4,000 or $5,000 for that. I mean, the palm oil sector, they were talking about figures that were lesser, maybe because they maybe had other benefits in kind that they managed to negotiate, that, you know, the cash salary is one thing, but benefits another thing as well. So I think theirs was a lower kind of reparation level, perhaps it was implied, but actually a lot of these things are not really discussed, because I don't think companies want to talk about you know, how much reparations they pay. So I mean, in the grapevine, we're hearing quite a few plantation companies paying that actually, but just not wanting to pay that. So at least that's happening. Another thing that came out during the COVID pandemic as well was that the Malaysian regulators themselves discovered that you know, there was 90% non-compliance with the Housing Act of Malaysia, because I didn't show the pictures here, but you know, you were people staying in sort of plywood kind of situation under a, you know, big zinc roof, you know, they were, or in construction sites, you know, there. And then, but then the palm oil industry will then respond that, you know, oh no, we were forced to transition already, you know, earlier in the 70s and 80s, where they were building, you know, structures, which were better already earlier. And then why these other sectors then had to do this later. So there's a couple of aspects to that. I would say it's the housing, it's the debt bondage that came in, which is why these reparations figures come in, and which is why I kind of, you know, briefly put that, you know, once I sort of tried to triangulate what construction people were telling me, what you could read about factories, then, you know, it seemed as though that the companies were, or at least they were spending an extra 20% on sort of housing and transport for the workers. But then if you then went to the degree of having proper dormitories, custom-built dormitories, and that would, and then transport, right? Then you would actually have to bus people in or truck people in or whatever. Then that would actually increase another 20%. So it would be an extra 40–50% on that. So that was kind of my estimates on that. Of course, plantation situation is a bit different because they are in situ. And from what I can see, the RSPO did some like analysis of prevailing wages in Sabah. So then they said that the cash wage was so much, but then you know, the benefits in kind were then, I think, another 40%. So then that kind of pushes it to that kind of level of what I was seeing on the construction and electronic and rubber glove companies, obviously having underspent on these extras which had to happen. Because for plantations, they're in situ, so that's that, on at least the housing and the transport situation. But then, of course, you have other questions about debt bondage, which I think is really not reported and not discussed. Just don't want to talk about it. But I think it is happening, because you've got other sectors, right? Often the workers don't know where they're working. So do they care whether you're going to work for Dyson or Goodyear or plantation company? It may not be that clear to the workers which sector they're going for. But essentially, it would be helpful at the company level if Malaysia did systemic reform of this. But I'm not sure even to today that it's obvious that there's any political will to do so. So if it's not systemically reformed at a political level, then it becomes a company cost.
Thank you for that. We have a question from our online audience, Peter MacArthur. He asked, what impact of climate change induced erratic weather on palm oil production? And is the increased use of fertilizer one way to increase intensification of production to avoid more monoculture encroachment resulting in deforestation?
Yeah, that's intensification is a popular story in palm oil. So it's not just about applying more agrochemicals or fertilizers. They actually have better planting materials. So there are planting materials which are promised to increase the yield by, you know, sorry, I'm not sure how much. But the problem is at the aggregate level, it's not helping, because I think there's a shortage of labor for Malaysia. It's really interesting. I was just looking at the aggregate yield for Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and even Colombia. They were all sort of coalescing at the same level. And of course, places like Thailand and Colombia are less ideal, right? Because they have longer dry periods and they're higher latitudes.
So then that goes to that first question, what happens when there's dry weather? So then the places which are less ideally agronomic, that means they're going to have more shortfall of water. This is where palm prefers like steady, like, at least 200 mm a month, steady through the whole year is the ideal scenario. And then what happens is that during the dry seasons, it's longer for those areas where it's higher latitude. And then in addition, when you have these El Nino and La Nina phenomenon, especially El Nino, you can see like Thailand yield dropping more significantly than, let's say Malaysia, Indonesia, where it would be, even though you have these dry climate drivers, it would drop, but maybe not as much. So you see more accentuated movements for those, I feel. But of course, with new planting materials coming in, they're supposed to try to even things out, more drought resistant and everything. But I think interesting questions arise because India wants to plant it, so they have to do irrigation. So then that's a whole bunch of costs. And maybe, I'm not sure whether that requires more fertilizer or less. I think the good thing about palm oil is that it's generally less agrochemicals and fertilizers. Actually, quite a lot of fertilizers, but definitely a lot less agrochemicals than what would be required to plant and crops or the other vegetable products. So its tendency a bit low on the lower side. And then on fertilizers, they also try to replace with say like the empty fruit bunch. After you strip all the fruits off, that oil palm branch that looked a bit like well, not really great, but yeah, it's huge, right? Then they put that material out into the field because they know there's a whole bunch of nutrients in that as well. And then they put it out into the field. So there's an effort to reduce that. And there is a little bit of organic planting of palm oil in Latin America because they have such high labor costs that they have to do everything they can to do very high value products. So then there's a couple of companies that do organic palm oil. So you can get something like organic red palm oil, that thing. But of course, you need to have a more remote location, right? You can't be downstream of other people and stuff. So yeah, the people do try to work on all these aspects. And what's interesting is that the genome of palm oil has been analyzed, and they can also do things like testing and excluding planting material that is what they call contaminated material, which is a low yield. So one thing is actually growing higher yield. Another thing is to eliminate low yield. And this is where, ironically, Indonesia is going to be the first mass implementing of Malaysian technology from the Malaysian Palm Oil Board. Then screen out for all its smallholders the contaminated low yielding material. And so we should anticipate better incomes for farmers. So that's a really good thing that Indonesia is going to be doing. They're going to have national laboratory to do this screening.
So is that the gene editing they're using?
They're not editing.
No.
They've analyzed the genes so they can remove some of these. They know what the planting material is. They can test. In fact, it's a Malaysia and US collaboration on this.
I'm having also a hard time formulating this question, and it's somewhat influenced by Amy's. Thank you. That was just so, so much, so it's very hard to digest. But there's a positive note that you present on the green interest and these standards. So I want to know who created the standards. Why are you so positive about them if there's so much ability to kind of lie about them? If 90% are labor standards part and workers' rights and all that part of the standards that you're referring to, that palm oil can appeal to saying we're better because we meet these standards?
Yeah, it came from different strands actually. I mean, the roundtable on sustainable palm oil sort of kicked off in 2004. So I think their certification started to roll out around, more aggressively towards 2010 onwards.
So it's a roundtable that created these standards.
So
does it have labor rights?
It does have, but then clearly, when you have USCBP, they have the ILO, 11 indicators of that, and somehow it wasn't enough, right? So I guess somehow I suppose NGOs presented information to the US CBP. I mean, quite often what we do is, as you point out, it's hard to investigate. You can't go there, you can't get in, but somehow some people manage to get access, whether it's maybe talking. I mean, I know certain cases in Indonesia, they talk to the union, so 100 people from the union will talk to you. The earlier reports for Wall Street Journal, I think the journalists managed to talk to a couple of people, and so from that, we started to get the information coming out. But yeah, I mean, but even Malaysia did a survey as well, and they found a certain level of labor in certain parts. The incidence was in basically the low single digits and things. So I think one of the problems of the industry is that they themselves seem to lack data to then able to rebut, right? I mean, they don't seem to do census, they don't seem to do their own surveys to try to counter these things. So then it's left to these voluntary organizations like, Roundtable, which is essentially businesses and NGOs are together. It was initiated by WWF, so it's sort of like the younger cousin of FSC, right? So FSC's cutoff date is, I think it was way back in the 90s, right? And then this came a lot later. And then of course WWF also initiated things like, probably would have seen Marine Stewardship Council when you buy seafood. So this is part of that whole range of things, which is WWF is a key influencer and a stakeholder in the policy of these things. And then what we have now from that voluntary is now regulatory. So then the regulators have come in and come in a way, yeah, like you saw the, Hong Kong regulator testing the products, and these things are not part of it, right? Or, US DPP, 11 forced labor thing. So maybe I think what's happening is that these voluntary standards have to evolve because regulators in US or even elsewhere, Pakistan may have their ideas about certain issues about the palm oil product, which then have to come in. And I guess then there's a continuous improvement. Of course, some of us call it continuous improvement. Sometimes if you talk to people in the palm oil, they say the goalpost keeps changing. So there's obviously different perceptions about whether you are creating the standards or you think people should add on costs. And then if you are facing the cost, then there is that kind of pushback as well. But I mean, the broad perception is that Europe is more environmentally conscious. The US is more labor conscious, maybe because of different historical reasons, for obvious reasons. And then even within Europe, Southern Europe doesn't seem to, it's not perceived to care so much about environmental, they care about health, about, the contaminants, potential contaminants in palm oil. So different regions in the destinations have their different, concerns. Then I think the regulators and the public interest, of course, pushes that.
Thank you. So we have time for one more question. I'm going to ask a question from the audience, the online audience. You spoke about the condition of transboundary haze as a result of the growth of peatlands and the yearly haze outlook report. Will you be able to share a little more about what the various countries are doing to manage the issue of transboundary haze, successes and failures?
Well, just talking about Southeast Asia then, I mean, what we do have is huge peat areas in Sumatra. There are pockets of peat areas also in Peninsular Malaysia. And if you look up Malaysian headlines, you'll see that these sometimes also have burning problems. And Malaysian firefighters have to go and put them out. And so sometimes you wonder whether is it unfair to always blame Indonesia, because sometimes there's domestic and even cars, right? A lot of that, and even sometimes visually, is it haze, is it air pollutants? So what has happened in the region is there's ASEAN haze sort of situation. They publish. There's a website from ASEAN where they publish this information about air pollution, and it's also not just about the southern belt. Actually, northern ASEAN has huge problems of burning of agricultural waste as well. Which then, if you go to Chiang Mai at the wrong time of year, it's burning. It's smoke. You can smell it a lot. And then, of course, in Kalimantan side, there are peat areas in the south, all across that belt, the southern area as well. So what has happened, and of course Sarawak, so slightly different approach in different areas. I think in Sarawak, what they have is they do a lot of compaction of the peat. So when they compact it, it actually allows you to plant oil palm and get better yields, and it also reduces the fire risk of that. So this is done a lot by Sarawak has its own tropical peat lab. Dr. Yu-leng, she's a very enthusiastic lady who knows her things, and Sarawak has that approach. And I think if you look at during the hay season, there usually isn't that much fire risk there. Little bit in Peninsula, again, they have to get onto it. It's mainly Sumatra that's been happening over the years. It kind of happens every 2-3 years. We've had a gap of 3 years because of the wet season and the extended La Nina. But what Indonesia has done is that it has put a lot of onus and responsibility to the police, regional police and regional army. And they do take people, they do grab people and say you set fire. They implement that. The companies also have had to invest in fire prevention and protection. And the companies also, there were certain pilot projects where they actually funded villages to use non-fire burn methods as well, which is obviously more costly. Because traditionally, agriculture globally just use fire for various reasons. Not just cost, but it sort of kills the bugs and pests and everything as well. So there's been a transition to that, because if you looked in the past, there was also an interesting link, not just with the weather cycle, but with political cycle. Then if you had the dry spell and an election next year, that was a glaring thing, because then politicians would just say, yeah, just go and do it. I know you bought all your seeds, the prices, so price up, weather, and elections. Those were always traditionally the indicators. So there's a big challenge now for Indonesia for election next year as well. And people did buy a lot of seeds. So how are they going to plant? But I think that with the corporations' activities and also efforts to restore the peatlands, of course, there's questions about it, because they'll say that they want to maintain a higher water table. So that's what you do with peatlands. You maintain a higher water table. Of course, the criticism is that this has been fluctuating a lot more. People expected, because some data was published about it a couple of months ago. And so there's question marks on that. But clearly they monitor the water levels, and then compaction by companies, because it's not just to reduce fire, but this also improves the yield, whatever you're planting. And just having fire towers. You'll see people have fire towers out there, and the police and army involved. So it's kind of a big range of things. And they have also actually fined companies. There's been a few landmark cases about jailing company executives and fining. To find the company. Whether they collected is another thing as well. But yeah, a whole bunch of effort.
Thank you. Well, I think we're out of time, so thank you very much for your presentation, for answering all of our questions today.